Hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Caitlin Mason, and I am the Outreach Coordinator here at California Youth Advocacy Network. And I'll be presenting today's webinar entitled Youth and Young Adult Use Behavior, Findings from Research. As the title implies, this is going to be a very research and data-heavy webinar, so I apologize in advance. But the good news is that this webinar is actually structured to be a two-part series. So today I will be doing sort of a deep dive into the most current research and data regarding youth and young adult tobacco use. And then in 2 weeks, my colleague Kim will be doing the second part of this, which will be the complete opposite. And she will be presenting findings from our focus groups, which we completed this spring of 2019. And into the summer, and that was with young folks from all over the state. So that's going to be more narrative and qualitative of the two. And if you haven't done so already, please do be sure to register on our website. So again, as a caveat, we are going to be covering a lot today, but the good news is that this is recorded, and the slides and the recording will be made available for you on our website. And also, just a little bit of housekeeping, we do have our chat box open for questions. And my hope is that we will have some time at the end of this presentation for any questions. But if for whatever reason that isn't the case, I will have my contact information there for you to email any questions. So for those of you that aren't familiar with the California Youth Advocacy Network, or CYAN, we are a statewide agency offering technical assistance. So we work with all of you on the local level to engage youth and young adults to do tobacco control advocacy. And we are fully funded by CTCP through the California Department of Public Health. We have 3 primary programs. As you can see there, our youth program focuses on youth engagement, and that's really to impact local policy change. Our college program works directly with college campuses, really to support them in adopting and implementing and enforcing tobacco-free policies, and also to encourage and support young folks to quit. And then our military program really focuses on changing the norms of tobacco use within military populations and helping installations and veterans clinics throughout the state with prevention and treatment. And then you can see there on the right, we have a short list of some of the assistance our organization offers. So in terms of what we will be covering today, again, it's a lot, but we're going to start with our why. Why focus on young people? And this might seem really obvious, but there have been some really significant shifts in how youth and young adults have been using tobacco over the course of the last 25 years. So it's a really important point to understand the trajectory and the shifts so that we can appropriately respond. Next, we're going to look at the most recent prevalence data and use data for both youth and young adults. And we're going to look at this both from the national data and also California specific data. Then we're going to jump into and really look at what products the young people are using. Again, the rates of both national and statewide use, and any changes or trends related to use. After that, we're going to talk about really what the research says regarding why young people are using tobacco. And then finally, we're going to jump into marijuana, which has been a hot topic and also a frequent topic that has come up in our focus groups. And we'll share, again, prevalence data and trends related to that. Before we jump into everything, there is a small call out that I'd like to make. You may notice some variations in data, particularly so related to young adult data. And this isn't because one source is correct or incorrect, but rather there tends to be a range of ages with samples. Some are 18 to 25. Some, for example, like with the California facts and figures, are 18 to 30. When we talk about college age data, often that's 19 to 22. Some data is grouped into high school and middle school. So again, this really varies by what report you're reading and what data set you're looking at. But for the sort of general purposes of this presentation, when we speak about youth, we're talking about 12 to 17-year-olds. And when we're talking about young adults, this is typically going to mean 18 to 25. All right, so our foundation, why focus on young people? So in the past years, we saw that about 90% of young people were starting to use tobacco before the age of 18. And this number was starting to shift, but more critically, 98% of folks beginning to initiate their use by the age of 25. So we focus on young people because this is when they're initiating use. And Big Tobacco knows this too. And they've known this for quite some time, which is why they target so aggressively youth and young adult populations. And so what we were seeing is that initiation isn't just starting before the age of 18, but all the way through and into the years of young adulthood. And I do have to point out that we are seeing some changes in this use pattern as a result of vaping and addiction starting to initiate at younger ages with folks, and we'll get into that further in the presentation. But overwhelmingly, this is a critical age for Big Tobacco because they know that they have to addict a young person within this window to rewire the young person's brain for addiction. And so again, this is why we have to focus on young people, because this is really when they're starting to establish a lifetime of addiction. So in terms of youth and young adult use behavior and what we know about it, and again, this is really important to understand because this understanding of this use behavior is how we learn how to talk to young people, what terminology they use, and also more importantly for cessation messaging. And we're not going to get into cessation messaging, but it's an important call out so that we really do understand that use behavior is our foundation. So in terms of what we know, well, it's becoming more daily. Historically, we saw that youth and young adults were not typically daily tobacco users, but really it was rather more social or occasional. And this is beginning to shift, and that's due in part because of the increase in vaping. We know again that addiction establishment happens somewhere before the age of 25. We also know that with young people, dual use is very common. And some of our most recent data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey is showing us that approximately 1 in 3 middle schoolers and 2 to 5 high schoolers are reporting dual use, with e-cigarettes being the most commonly reported product in combination with another tobacco product. We also know, and this is probably no surprise, that young people like to use flavored products. Flavors tend to mask the harshness of tobacco or nicotine. And that a large portion of young folks have started and initiated their tobacco use with a flavored product. The good news is that we do know that on the whole, young people are more likely to quit. And when we compare this use behavior to adults, we find the opposite. Typically, adults are less likely to quit. They tend to experience longer terms of addiction. And overall, they tend to have more consistent daily use of tobacco. All right, so jumping into the data, and again, you're going to see lots of numbers on these slides, so bear with me, we are in this together. So we'll start with the good news, which is that smoking among youth has continued to decline and is currently now in California at a historic low of 2%. And this is significantly lower than the national smoking data, which you can see is the yellow line there and is just tipping over at 8%. Unfortunately, that is where our good news ends in this presentation because we see a very different story when we look at e-cigarette use. Both nationally and in California, youth are overwhelmingly using e-cigarette devices. And we're going to start by looking at the year-over-year data from the National Youth Tobacco Survey. So we're going to start with 2017-18, and then jump into the most recent preliminary data from the 2019 survey. So when we hear the Surgeon General call vaping an epidemic, this is why. This infograph really says it all. There was a 78% increase in use among high school students between 2017 and 2018, and nearly a 50% increase among middle schoolers. So again, really startling numbers. In this time period as well, we also saw significant increases in both daily use and also the use of flavors. So essentially what that translates to is nearly 30% of high school students using an e-cigarette more than 20 days in a month, which is just astounding. And then again, most alarmingly, we did also see an overall increase in the use of any tobacco product, and that is the graphic there on the right. We do have, let's move forward here, we do have preliminary data from the 2019 survey, as I mentioned. And again, it's much of the same story. E-cigarette use shot up from 20% to nearly 28%. And that's high school students' national use. And this is a really helpful view of sort of the landscape over the last 8 years. But particularly so in the last 5 years, which is where we've seen the enormous spike in youth use. In 2017, approximately 11% of high school students had used an e-cigarette within 30 days. And by 2018, that number had risen to nearly 21%. And in this current year, that number is at almost 28%. So to get this into perspective, we're literally looking at an 1,800% increase in just 8 years, which is astronomical. And when we look at flavors, which is what this graph is here, we see that fruit and mint and candy really are the dominant preferences amongst young people. And there is an important discussion that we need to have about mint and menthol. There tends to be this argument that comes up time and time again that young people aren't using mint, and that just simply isn't true. And it's, as we can see from this graph, nearly as popular as the fruit flavors. So this prevailing idea that if we just remove the candy flavors or the sweet flavors or the things that we think youth would like, it's not the answer, because we know that mint is being used at nearly equivalent rates. And again, just sort of zooming out more, there's an even larger discussion about how we need to discuss specific communities being targeted by specific flavors. And again, we'll get into that a little bit later. And then just kind of expanding here beyond e-cigarettes, we do see use among high school students across other products. And this is a helpful infographic from the CDC. This really sort of paints the whole landscape here, but keep in mind, again, that this is an infographic from 2018. And we already know from our preliminary data from the Youth Tobacco Survey that that e-cigarette number is well over 27%. So again, not up to date, but again, a very helpful visual to see the comparison to other products that young folks are using. And so now we're jumping into California specific data. So looking at year-over-year data for California, like the national data, we can see that there's a similar trend for all other tobacco products to be decreasing, and an increase in e-cigarettes. And so that 12.7 number, again, is impressive compared to the national number. But when we look at the use of e-cigarettes in comparison to the other products, we can really pinpoint where our attention needs to be. And then again, this is just for 2018. Again, national number over 20%, California at 12.7, which should be applauded. But when we take that 12.7 and we dive into population-specific data, it paints a very different story. So that 12.7 number now is the red line across your screen. And those blue columns are communities within California. So again, particularly so for trans young people and LGBTQ folks, American Indian youth and Pacific Islander folks. And with this lens of, population and community specific, it's critical that we understand that when we're working within these communities who've been targeted differently or have intersecting disparities or different social norms around tobacco, that we address those and really dive into that. And again, this graph, I think, really illustrates for us in the tobacco control world, the areas that we need to really do better in and improve in, because again, when we transpose 12.7 on community and population specific data, it's a different story. Lots of numbers here, but just pay attention to what's highlighted. Like the national data, the most commonly used products among youth were e-cigarettes. And when we dive into who is using, we see that across high school students in California, this use was true and the highest across grade, across gender, and across ethnicity. And again, that's the highlighted yellow line there. And this is a graph, again, from California Facts and Figures that shows us flavored products. Overwhelmingly, young people are using flavors. Nearly 90% of youth who are current users are using a flavored product. So again, not a surprise for many of you, I'm sure, but when we are discussing tobacco with youth populations, we have to talk about flavors. Flavors matter. Looking again at lots of numbers here, but I think it's important to see the broader impact of flavors and flavored tobacco product use across genders and ethnicities and grades. When we look at a preference for flavors, which is the table on the right, we can see that like the national data, fruit or sweet flavors were typically the most popular amongst youth, followed by mint. But mint was preferred at a much lower rate here in California. However, an important call out here is the preference by product type. So mint, for example, was the most popular flavor among cigarette and smokeless tobacco users, and it was the most popular flavor amongst 100% of youth cigarette users in California. Whereas fruity or sweet was the most popular flavor among other tobacco product users. So again, not just talking about flavors, but really more specifically what flavors in what products is equally as important. And then this is frequency of use specific to California. And again, if we look at that yellow column there, we can see that nearly 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 high school students in California is using a tobacco product between 20 to 30 days in a month. I mean, let that sink in. That's astounding to think about. And we are continuing to see this number grow. So getting into young adult data. So again, this is primarily going to be the 18 to 25 range, and this is where you're going to see some variation in data age grouping. This is a really helpful visual here. From 2014 to 2018, the percentage of young adults aged 18 to 24 who were currently smoking cigarettes decreased rapidly, and that's that top solid line. However, conversely, the percentage of young adults in this age group who were using electronic cigarettes increased rapidly. And that number is even higher now. So it's a really helpful visual to see we may be doing well with strides in traditional combustible cigarettes, but we're seeing massive increases in e-cigarettes and vaping devices in this population as well. Like youth, young adults used e-cigarettes at the highest rate, and we saw increases in the frequency of use as well. Frequent or daily use in particular nearly tripled in 5 years for this group. So in 2013, use every day or someday was at 2.4%, and just last year it was at 7.6%. And when we look at the adult population in terms of who is using this product, again, overwhelmingly it's young people, and it's young people under the age of 25. And that graphic there is from the National Health Interview Survey. Just a very helpful picture. And when we look at college students in particular, that number is even higher. And again, this is ages 19 to 22. And we see that their reported past month vaping more than doubled, jumping to just over 15%, compared to a 6.1% rate in 2017. And it's important to note that this jump is among the greatest one-year increase ever seen for any substance in the history of this survey. And again, comparing that with a non-college population, we can see that college students are using at 3% higher rates. So again, historical highs within this population. And now this is data specific to young adult use here in California. And looking at California, we see that cigarettes continue to decline, while e-cigarettes and the use of marijuana, which is the far right lines there, continue to climb. And we will be talking about marijuana later, so put a pin in any questions related to that. We have a whole section on it. And furthermore, of the young adult tobacco users, nearly 60% of them are using a flavored product. So again, with a discussion about flavors, we can't just focus on youth. We have to talk about young adults too, because they're using them at equivalent rates and they need to be part of this discussion as well. It's not just youth, it's also young adults. And then this is just, again, another infograph painting the picture of use across other types of tobacco products. Again, showing us the overall use rate of 22.8% on the right, and the variation in age between 18 plus and 18 to 30, which again, we know is a very critical time for addiction initiation. So diving more specifically in the products that we're seeing used by youth and young adult populations, we're going to talk about the most popular, and we're going to start with hookah. And so what we have up there are the youth, young adult rates for California, and also nationally. Just to kind of back up a little bit, hookah is a water pipe that's used for smoking typically tobacco or shisha, and it can also be used to smoke cannabis or other herb compounds. But primarily what you're going to find is a mixture of shredded tobacco leaf, honey, molasses, or some kind of dried fruit. And typically it's heavily flavored. And again, an important segue here with flavors, because hookah comes in hundreds of flavors. And really, these flavors are what are increasing the likelihood of initiation among non-smokers or never smokers, and also the continued use of hookah amongst regular users. Research also tells us that the use of hookah is used by folks who would otherwise probably not use tobacco, and it can often be the gateway for the use of other tobacco products. And in particular, we're seeing that there is a link between hookah use and combustible cigarettes. And actually, we're finding in research and in current studies that the dual use of cigarettes and hookah is more common than just the use of hookah alone. When we look at who is using hookah, we do see a small percentage of use amongst middle school and high school students, but again, overwhelmingly, it's young adults who are using this, and in particular, it's college students. The research does give us some predictors of who we may see higher rates of use from, and those include, again, probably not surprising from the data, college students, but in particular, younger students, students who are living on campus, students who are living in more social environments, so young people who are in a sorority house or some type of group living, students who have used cigarettes, alcohol, marijuana, or other drugs. And finally, hookah use is significantly more common and has higher use rates on the West Coast. And then just quickly, this is a survey that we did here at CYN in March of 2019. And we surveyed college students in Los Angeles, particularly regarding their observation and use of hookah. And it really yielded some startling results. Students reported that nearly half of them had been to a hookah bar or shop. And almost 40% of these students reported that that hookah bar or shop was located within 2 miles of their college campus. And so what we know from the data is that while hookah use is likely not necessarily daily, it is occurring in social environments like parties or student gatherings. And with the prevalence of hookah bars near campus, it's very concerning because, again, we know that there's a strong link between hookah use and future intention of additional tobacco use. Jumping into the next product, which are little cigars and cigarillos. And again, a cigar is essentially any tobacco product that has a tobacco leaf or a tobacco wrapper. We do have the use rates up there for California and also nationally for youth and young adults. There are 3 types of cigars sold here in the United States: large cigars, cigarillos, and little cigars. We don't see a lot of use with large cigars. We primarily see use of cigarillos and little cigars here, and those are typically flavored. And most often we are seeing that young people are hollowing them out and using them to smoke marijuana or making a blunt. And data has showed us that nearly half of youth who've used a cigar in the past 30 days are using them to make blunts. And this is concerning for a number of reasons, particularly so because we know that the young folks are inhaling both tobacco and marijuana smoke when they're using a cigar wrapper to make a blunt. In terms of use behavior and patterns, the research does point to a high rate of dual use among youth and young adults who are using these little flavored cigars. In 2018, African American high school students did have the highest rate of cigar use nationally. However, here in California, we did see a difference. We did find that American Indian, Alaska Native high school students actually had the highest cigar rate here in the state. Additionally, flavors are very popular with this product. California youth used flavored little cigars and little cigarillos at nearly 7 times the rate of non-flavored products. So again, flavors matter with these. And Black and Mild and Swisher Sweets were the most popular brands among both youth and young adults. And again, we'll go more into depth with this marijuana overlap in the last section of this webinar because I'm certain there'll be some questions. Next, we're going to chat a little bit about smokeless tobacco. Not particularly high use rates here in California, much higher youth use rate nationally. This is a variety of products, and this encompasses chewing tobacco, snuff or dip, and snus. We don't, again, see super high rates in California, but we do know that there tends to be greater use in California among young men in particular, young male athletes, and also young people who are living in more rural areas in the state. Also with regard to young adults or college-aged Californians, we do see that they are, male students are using this product at 3 times the rate of their female peers. Excuse me, for high school students. And for college males, they're using that at a rate of 20% greater than their female peers. So again, very heavily male use pattern here. Nationally, like I said, use is highest among males. aged 18 to 24, and again, living in the Midwest or southern areas of the United States. And we do see a very high use rate among young adult males, particularly so young males in the military and also first responders. And again, although the rates aren't particularly high, I think it's important that we do talk about these products because Swedish Match, who makes snus products, is now able to market some of these products as having lower health risks than regular cigarettes, especially so related to cancer and lung disease and stroke risk. But that does not mean that these products are risk-free. And the worry with this type of messaging of lower risk, especially around youth, is that this could be appealing for young people who could potentially be wanting to switch from a traditional tobacco product. These products, again, are also flavored, which is a concern. And again, typically they tend to be mint flavored, which we know young people use at high rates. Finally, there I wanted to point out Zyn, which is the image on the right. And this is one of the most recent products in this sort of category of smokeless. So we're getting a lot of questions about this as well. This is also a Swedish Match product, and it's actually a flavored nicotine powder pouch. It's a pouch. And it's essentially designed to be stuck inside a person's lip, and it's being marketed as like a spitless dip. These pouches are sold in 3 or 6 milligram strengths of nicotine, and they are flavored. So they've got a citrus mint, they've got a cool mint, they've got a cinnamon. RJ Reynolds also makes a version of this product, which is called Velo. And again, we're not seeing a ton of use with these, but the worry here is that because they are being marketed as tobacco-free, which is not correct because they're extracting the nicotine from a tobacco leaf, the worry is that young folks will interpret these as having a lower harm or being harm-free. So again, just something to be on the lookout for. We haven't had reports of use yet, but again, we know we have to be vigilant because things can change quickly in this world. Jumping into e-cigarettes, helpful chart here for us to see, and again, both California and national data. The last 5 years have seen enormous spikes in youth use rates. It's important call out once again, which is that we can't leave young adults out of this discussion because their use rate in California is only slightly lower than that of young people. So again, we really need to be working with young people until the age of 25 because this is the critical age for addiction development. And when we compare these rates to the adult use rates, the difference is staggering. It really highlights just how much youth is targeted with these products. You know, when you compare the age of 30 in California of a use rate of 1.8% to a youth or young adult rate of roughly 10%, it paints a very clear picture of who these products are made for. And there tends to be a lot of misperceptions around harm risk when we discuss e-cigarette use with young people. Until recently, there was this feeling, and we've heard this frequently in focus groups, which again, Kim will go into in detail in the next webinar, that vaping was somehow less harmful than cigarettes, or that it was just water vapor or flavor. And most startling, some young people didn't even know that these products contained nicotine. The Truth Initiative did a study which showed that nearly 2/3 of Juul users who were between the ages of 15 and 21 weren't even aware that the product they were smoking on a daily basis actually contained nicotine. So again, changing these misperceptions is really, really critical when we work with young people. So kind of going over the products that we're seeing and hearing about from young people in our focus groups and from all of you in the field. I'm just going to do a brief overview of kind of the history of products and then dive into more product specific information. So e-cigarettes typically fall into four buckets. We've got the Cigalikes there on the left, pens, mods, and then the pod system, which is, again, the Juul, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Cigalikes came onto the market somewhere around 2007. And these devices were mostly designed to resemble a regular cigarette and were disposable. Pens or vape pens came sort of next in this evolution. And they tended to be larger. They have a rechargeable battery. They've got a refillable cartridge. And these can be filled with either nicotine or THC. Next there in the middle picture, we've got mods or tanks. And they're the largest of the variety of devices. They have a larger battery. They're refillable. And these, because of the battery size, are able to create more aerosol, which allows the person who's inhaling it to get a greater amount of nicotine. So that's why you see those large sort of cloud chasing competitions and big ploofs of vapor and aerosol, and that's coming from a mod. And then finally there on the right, we've got our pod systems. These are smaller. They often look like a USB. They have a battery that you can even charge on a USB most of the time or plug into a computer. And these come with pre-filled pods. Some of the most recognizable devices or more popular devices are going to fall into this category here of pod systems. And we are primarily hearing reports of use with pens, so the vape pens and also the pods, which we'll get into in the next slides. And again, Kim will really give you specifics on that in her second webinar in this series. And then just there on the right to call out is one of our resources, which you can download. It's on our website now, and it gives a really helpful overview of the types of products, the e-liquids that young people are using to fill these products, and also a size reference and a brief description. So that is available for download on our website. So in terms of what types of devices youth and young adults are using, we are mostly seeing pod systems again, primarily Juul, but there are variations in product use by location and ethnicity here in California. Excuse me, and that'll be discussed in the next webinar. So here's kind of our typical lineup. We've got Soren, Smoke, Juul, and then those two on the right are some of the newer products, the Puff Bar and Stig. And those are actually disposable vape pens. So once you have puffed all the aerosol and the flavoring out of it, you actually just toss them, which again presents a bit of a headache and a nightmare for recycling and waste and again the environment, but whole other bag of or can of worms. So again, frequency of use with these products, both in research and what we're hearing from focus groups, is really startling. Here in California, 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 high school students is using one of these products between 20 to 30 days in a month. And then these are some of the most recent products that have come to the market. We haven't really heard many reports of young people having these in schools in our local area, but I did want to share them with you. That product there on the left called the Amulet is actually a vape watch. And it looks a lot like an Apple Watch. And you can take it off and puff it and pop it right back in. In the middle there is vaporware, which is sort of a category for any kind of clothing or bag that you can integrate your vaping device into. So that young man there can actually pick up that string on his hoodie and take a puff and set it right back down, or use what looks like a water tube from his backpack to hit his device. And then that final product there on the right is the IQOS, which is the heat not burn product that just hit the market. And that actually stands for I Quit Ordinary Smoking. And again, we haven't really seen these in our local area, heard reports of these, but it really just shows how quickly the industry is evolving and how vigilant we need to be. And when we think, And when we think about, like what type of person would purchase these items, who is going to be heavy into tech? Who would want to wear something that looks like an Apple Watch? Who's most likely to have a backpack or a hoodie? It's young people. And you can really see how targeted that is by how this market is evolving. And what I found so shocking was that the Amulet vape watch was only $35. So again, very deliberate, very youth targeted. So jumping into research about why young people are using tobacco, we know that the tobacco industry has clever marketing tactics, specifically targeting young people. Exposure to this type of marketing has been heavily researched, and studies are showing us that youth and young adult exposure to these types of ads, just looking at these three, Juul, everyone's fun and happy and free-spirited. This creates a sense of positive expectation from that product use. So, for example, one study found that viewing images like this actually gave the idea that use would provide a pleasurable taste, a pleasurable smell, and that it would be safe and socially acceptable. And they also found that these outcomes were directly correlated with future use. We also know that young people use tobacco because of flavors, and marketing and flavors go hand in hand. There's over 15,000 different flavored products on the market right now. Flavors will mask the harsh taste of tobacco, making it easier for the youth to initiate use, and also easier for continued use. And several studies have shown us that flavors do play a major role in youth initiation. And in California alone, 86% of young people report using a flavored product. An important point out here too, which I think that little image there from Flavors Hook Kids, is that 4 out of 5 youth actually started with a flavored product. We also know that the social and physical environments can impact and influence young people's tobacco use. We know that young people are more likely to use tobacco if they have friends and peers who are using tobacco. We know that they are more likely to use tobacco if their parents or an older sibling is using tobacco. And we also know that young people are more likely to use tobacco if it's more prevalent or accepted within their community. Conversely, some social and environmental factors in studies are showing that these social and physical environments can actually work to lower tobacco use, and those tend to be being part of a religious group or a tradition, being part of a family or a community with a strong ethnic sense of pride, or being in a school or having higher academic achievement. We also know that tobacco within the community can influence use. Exposure to tobacco marketing is associated with higher youth use. Things like proximity of retailers near school will impact use. The density of retailers near school is a significant predictor of tobacco experimentation. And research does show us that research shows us that adolescents exposed to e-cigarette ads in retail stores are twice as likely to start vaping within several years. And we also know that the price of tobacco influences use. So lower prices and lower taxes make tobacco products more affordable and accessible for youth. I won't go into depth on this, but this chart shows how closely linked youth smoking prevalence is to cigarette pack prices. As the prices climbed in the late 90s and early 2000s, youth smoking rates declined. But as the price decreased between 2003 and 2005, the rates began to, youth rates increased. So again, a direct correlation there. You can see that little spike, and then as price goes up, use trails down. And then there's a myriad of other factors that we know through research and studies that influence tobacco use. We know that mental health and stress can play a big part in a young person's initiation. There's a strong relationship between tobacco use and depression and anxiety and low self-image. And youth who report having these types of feelings have higher rates of tobacco use overall. An important call out related to stress in particular is that LGBTQ young folks often cite the stress and fear of coming out, the stress of homelessness, and fear related to being outed as one of the main predictors for their tobacco use. Studies have also shown us that there are certain biological and genetic factors that can play into use. For instance, youth may be more sensitive to nicotine, and they may feel dependent on nicotine sooner than adults. We also know that personal views on tobacco can impact use. For example, when a young person may expect certain things from smoking, like, again, coping with stress or losing weight, again, they're more likely to use tobacco. And then this one I think is really critical, which is this general misperception or overperception of youth use. So there tends to be a high perception of pure use among young people and a low perception of harm. And this can contribute to initiation and ongoing use. So for example, the table on the right there really highlights that gap between perceived use and actual use. The difference there being, a never use at 76%, but they believe only 10% of their peers haven't used any cigarette or tobacco. And again, looking at actual use of 12% of young people using a product versus a perception that over 80% have. So again, challenging these misperceptions and really turning that into a social norm model of saying, hey, only 12% of your peers are using this. Saying 83% of your peers aren't using this versus saying 12% are is a really powerful reframing. And getting into marijuana here for our last few minutes. So we all know that there is an overlap, right? Vaping, tobacco, and marijuana have a very big intersection. I'm sure this is something that's come up in the work that you've done as well. So again, in the following slides, you'll see prevalence data and just how dramatically youth and young adults use has increased, and particularly so here for young adults. So just a quick overview for the sake of time. I'm going to kind of quickly go through this. We are seeing the most significant overlap, which is probably not a surprise, in the populations who are using marijuana and also tobacco. It's youth, it's young people. Also, the products and the mode of consumption. Again, young people are primarily vaping marijuana in the same manner that they would vape a nicotine solution, or they're rolling blunts with a flavored cigar wrapper. Again, policy, big overlap here, thinking about our smoke-free protections and the policy around secondhand smoke. And then again, the industry. We know that these products are created with young people in mind, and the tobacco industry is really expanding into this area. And it's really important that we address this intersection and overlap, because there are real implications for things like surveillance and policy and public education, health outcomes, and most importantly, social norms around smoking and messaging around marijuana, particularly so when we talk about it being healthy or being medicine. So we're at a really critical and interesting point now in this debate. So this is the data from the Monitoring the Future National Survey. In 2017, they did something which was groundbreaking, and it was the first time ever. They included a question on vaping marijuana with young folks. And you can see there on the far right, nearly 6% of 12th graders are using marijuana almost daily. And when we talk about vaping marijuana or nicotine or what they think they're using, I think this is a really important graph here in the middle, which is that several of these young folks thought they were just vaping flavors. So again, strong misperceptions around not just marijuana, but also nicotine, and just a general disassociation of understanding what they're using and not having an idea that they could potentially be addicted to something and using two separate products. So challenging these misperceptions with young people is critical. And again, when we look across grades, this is again national youth data, grades and years across the board, we see a steady increase with both nicotine and also with marijuana. And so this is 8th, 10th, and 12th grade for 2017 and 2018. So this is California youth marijuana use. And what is, I think, so startling here is that California's youth are using marijuana at higher rates than they're actually using electronic cigarettes. 1 in 7 high school students in California is using marijuana. The rate of ever using marijuana and currently using marijuana are higher than the rate of using all tobacco products. Again, startling data. We also know from our research and data in the state that the dual use of marijuana and tobacco is relatively high. Of those students who are using marijuana, more than half of them reported using another form of tobacco. Most commonly, they were using e-cigarettes. And a higher proportion of those students who were using marijuana reported feelings of loneliness and depression. And this is looking at our young adult data. So this is national data. And this is when I was talking about including information on marijuana vaping, specific to college students. So we see that marijuana use is nearly the same for college students and for their non-college student peers. So they're both roughly at around 43%, which is about a 7% increase over the course of 5 years. Also important to note here, the jump in vaping of THC from 2017 and 2018 is one of the greatest one-year increases seen for a single substance in the history of this survey. So it's growing rapidly and at historic rates among the college youth population. So again, in terms of how young people are using marijuana, we are mostly seeing both blunts and vaping. So just again, sake of time, I know we're getting close to the end here. A blunt is a cigar filled with marijuana. And again, typically these are flavored and these tend to be cheap. As you can see, you can get several of them for less than $1. And over again in our focus groups, young people would identify little cigars and cigarillos as blunt wrappers. And that bottom image there actually is a tutorial on YouTube of how to roll rainbow blunts. So really prevalent, lots of youth videos and tutorials and Reddits, and almost sort of a culture around rolling them. And then in terms of common products that we're hearing about and seeing from young people in our area, these are probably the main ones. So PAX tends to be a little bit more expensive. This is a THC vape. You can actually adjust the temperature at which the nicotine can, or excuse me, the THC can be vaped. Stizzy and wax pens or dab pens. And then on the right there are the cartridges or the carts, and those are filled with the THC solution that you would put onto your wax or dab pen. So in terms of concerns, and there's several, we are seeing a changing use pattern with young people. So we're finding more frequent daily use. Again, a greater proportion of young people are using marijuana than they are using across the board in California any tobacco product. We also know that there's a high rate of dual use with tobacco and marijuana, so we're seeing more dual use come as a result of this. There's a higher potency of products. Over the past decade, the typical percentage of THC has increased in marijuana and in products, making them more potent and more dangerous. We also have concerns about the impact on the developing brain, and we're still really learning about this science. But the research is showing us that THC can have very negative effects on the adolescent brain, particularly so when it comes to memory and attention. It can impact or lower the quality of brain connections, and it can impact decision-making skills. There's also an increased risk for future addiction and the use of other substances. And then when we talk about things like long-term effects, and again, we're still learning these, but these tend to include things like respiratory impacts, mental health impacts, increased depression and anxiety, an increased risk of schizophrenia has been found with chronic use, and perhaps most startling is a correlation between lower IQ and poor educational outcomes from chronic use. And then the second part, like I said, of this webinar is going to be Kim jumping into our findings from our focus groups. And if you haven't done so, please do register. It's going to be a lot more qualitative, rich narrative data from the young people. And that's going to be on December 18th. From 10 to 11. So you can register on our website, you can register through partners. And again, it'll be a really nice second piece to seeing specifically what we're hearing from young people in our communities and comparing that back to the data and research that we're seeing on a national and a statewide level. We do have a few minutes here for questions. If anyone has anything that they would like to ask or comment on, now would be a great opportunity for that. If not, if something comes up or you have questions about the slides, my contact information, whoops. My contact information is in the presentation, which has restarted itself. All right. Well, thank you so much. Again, the 18th is Kim's presentation, and you can register for that on our website. Thanks so much.